Sometimes what takes everything from you isn't an enemy, it's the trust you gave to the wrong person. Late afternoon light stretched across the faded walls of a small suburban house. A house that had stood for over 40 years, filled with memories, laughter, and the soft echo of a life once shared. It belonged to Helen Porter, 67, widowed for more than a decade, living quietly in the home she and her late husband had built together. The air still carried traces of their past, the scent of old wood-framed wedding photos, the worn armchair he used to sit in the vase of dried flowers he once brought home one spring. Helen had never considered herself lonely. She had 2 sons, Andrew the eldest, who lived far away with his own family and a steady career, and Daniel the younger, who lived nearby, the one who still visited, the one who made her feel needed. Daniel had married Sophie, a beautiful, sharp, and charming young woman. From the first day, Sophie had called her Mom, with a sweetness that melted any guard left in Helen's heart. She would often say, "I'll take care of you, Mom. You've done enough already." Each word felt like sunlight through an old window, gentle, comforting, familiar. Sophie came by often, bringing groceries, watering the plants, sharing tea and stories. Her laughter filled the silence in the house. Sometimes she would take Helen's hand and say softly, "When you're with us, you'll never be alone." Helen believed her. She believed because believing was easier than doubting. One autumn evening, Daniel and Sophie came over for dinner. After the meal, Daniel leaned forward, his tone careful, almost shy. "Mom, I've been thinking, it might be better to put the house under shared ownership. Your name with mine and Sophie's. It's just for taxes, insurance, legal stuff. You'd still be the owner, of course, nothing changes." Helen frowned slightly. "Is that really necessary? I don't understand much about those things." Sophie reached out, smiling gently. "Mom, please don't worry. We just want to make things easier for you. You'll still hold the keys. We're just helping with paperwork." The warm light from the dining table flickered across their faces. Helen looked at her son, the boy she had raised alone after her husband's death, and the daughter-in-law who had become like family. She felt a wave of gratitude, of trust. "All right," she said, smiling faintly. "If you think it's best, do what you need to." Sophie opened her briefcase and took out a stack of printed documents. "Just sign here, Mom," she said softly. "It's all ready." Helen adjusted her glasses but didn't read closely. The words were small, the pages full of lines she couldn't quite follow. But she trusted them. She trusted the warmth in their voices, the promise in Sophie's eyes. Her hand trembled slightly as she signed her name, a signature born not from logic, but from love. Sophie placed her hand over Helen's and smiled. "Don't worry, Mom, everything is still yours." Helen smiled back, the kind of smile only a mother gives, filled with affection and peace. She didn't realize that in that moment she had just signed the most dangerous contract of her life, not a legal one, but a contract of trust. After they left, the house returned to silence. Helen sat by the window, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. On the table beside her, the signed papers rested next to her husband's old photograph. "Did I do the right thing, dear?" she whispered. "They just want to help me." There was no answer, only the soft ticking of the clock and the faint rustle of wind through the curtains. The house felt the same. And yet something unseen had shifted. She didn't know it, but that night a small seed had been planted, the seed of betrayal hidden beneath gentle voices, sweet promises, and a signature written in faith. The following weeks passed peacefully. Daniel still called. Sophie still visited with flowers. Everything seemed normal. But sometimes even peace can feel too quiet, the kind of quiet that hides a coming storm. And in that silence, destiny waited. The house, once filled with warmth, now held a secret, a piece of paper that had already begun to rewrite her life. That evening, Helen sat alone, her hand resting on the drawer where the contract now lay. She smiled faintly to herself, whispering, "My children would never hurt me." Outside, the wind brushed against the window, carrying the faint whisper of autumn leaves, a warning, gentle as breath, that she could not yet hear. At first, change came softly, like a breeze that moved the curtains, before it took the whole house with it. Weeks passed, and for a while everything seemed normal. Sophie still visited, smiling, calling Helen Mom with that same sugary tone. Daniel stopped by after work, sometimes bringing groceries or fixing a light bulb. On the surface, life went on as before. But beneath that calm, something invisible began to shift. One morning, Helen woke to the sound of furniture being moved. From the hallway, Sophie's voice floated in cheerful firm. "Don't worry, Mom, I'm just rearranging a few things. This old chair's too heavy for you anyway." Helen stepped out of her room, still half asleep, to find the living room transformed. The floral curtains she had sewn with her husband were gone, replaced by sleek gray drapes. The walls, once painted a soft honey color, now stood bare and white. Her husband's favorite armchair, the one with the worn armrest, was missing. "Sophie," she asked quietly, "where's your father's chair?" Sophie turned with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, Mom, it was falling apart. I sold it online. We'll get you something modern lighter. It's better for your back." Helen opened her mouth to protest, then stopped. The house felt different, colder, cleaner, emptier. Maybe Sophie was right. Maybe it was time for change. But that night, when Helen passed by the living room, the silence felt heavier. No sound of the rocking chair creaking, no scent of old wood, only the faint echo of what used to be home. In the days that followed, Sophie's touches spread like vines, small at first, then everywhere. She changed the silverware, replaced the lace tablecloth, removed the family photos from the hallway. "These old frames collect dust," she said lightly. "Let's store them for now." The "for now" never ended. Each time Helen tried to stop her, Sophie's voice would soften, her logic perfectly polished. "Mom, you shouldn't tire yourself with old things. Fresh energy, fresh life, that's what the house needs." Daniel, as usual, said nothing. He smiled awkwardly, muttered that Sophie just wanted to help, and left for work. Helen started spending more time in her room, the last space that still felt hers. But even there, Sophie's hand began to reach. One afternoon, Helen returned from a short walk to find Sophie folding her clothes. "Mom, your closet was so crowded I gave away a few pieces you never wear. You'll thank me later." Helen's chest tightened. Her late husband's old cardigan, the one he wore every Christmas, was gone. That evening she ate dinner in silence. Sophie chatted endlessly about redecorating, about how she wanted to brighten the place up. Daniel nodded along, not noticing how pale his mother had grown. Later, alone in her room, Helen looked around the furniture, shifted the colors, changed the air different. Her home no longer smelled like her life. It smelled like someone else's. A week later, Sophie knocked on her door holding a folder. "Mom, can we talk about your pension? You shouldn't handle finances alone. Let me manage it for you. I can invest part of it, grow your savings." Helen blinked, unsure. "My pension, I've always handled it just fine." Sophie smiled, the kind of smile that felt rehearsed. "Of course, but with inflation, interest rates, online banking, it's complicated. Let me take that burden. Family helps family, right?" Helen hesitated. Daniel stepped in, rubbing his neck. "Maybe it's easier that way, Mom. Sophie's good with numbers." Helen's stomach tightened. Something inside her whispered no, but her voice stayed silent. The same silence that had kept her kind her whole life and powerless. "All right," she murmured. "Just be careful." Sophie's smile widened. "Always, Mom. You can trust me." That night, Helen sat by the window, her hands folded on her lap. The garden below looked different too, the wildflowers trimmed, the bird bath gone. Even the laughter of children from the street sounded distant. The house had become spotless, polished, perfect, and utterly soulless. Weeks turned into months. Friends stopped visiting because Sophie handled everything. Helen's afternoons, once filled with tea and music, were now silent. She moved quietly through rooms that no longer remembered her. Sometimes she'd catch Sophie whispering on the phone, her tone low, businesslike. Sometimes Daniel would look away when she asked simple questions. And sometimes when Helen walked past the living room mirror, she hardly recognized herself. An old woman standing in a stranger's house, surrounded by nothing she'd chosen. One evening, she tried to find her husband's photo, the one that used to sit on the mantel. It was gone. When she asked Sophie, the answer came quick, almost too quick. "Oh, it broke while I was cleaning. I'll reprint it later." Helen nodded, but her chest felt hollow. That night, as she sat alone in the dim light of her bedroom, the truth began to whisper, faint but persistent. Something wasn't right. Something about the house, about Sophie's kindness, about the way Daniel avoided her eyes. It wasn't anger she felt, not yet. Just a strange, unfamiliar feeling she hadn't known in years' doubt. She pressed her hands together, trying to quiet the storm rising in her chest. "No," she told herself. This was family. Family doesn't hurt each other. Outside, the wind rattled the new gray curtains Sophie had hung. Helen watched them sway, her reflection faint in the glass. The house was still hers on paper, but it no longer belonged to her heart. And somewhere deep inside, for the first time, the warmth of trust began to cool into suspicion. Some betrayals don't shout. They whisper through paperwork sealed with a smile. The morning light was soft, almost kind, the kind of light that used to make Helen feel grateful to wake up in her own home. But that day it would show her something she could never unsee. She had gone to the local tax office, a folder in hand, planning to pay the property tax for the year. It was something she'd done every spring since her husband passed, a simple ritual of responsibility, one that made her feel steady, safe, still in control. The clerk, a young man with neat glasses, took her papers and typed a few words into his computer. Then he frowned. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you sure this is your property?" Helen blinked, confused. "Of course," she said. "It's been my home for 40 years. He hesitated, then turned the monitor slightly toward her. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The record lists the current owner as Mr. Daniel Porter." For a moment, Helen thought she hadn't heard right. Her ears buzzed, her chest tightened. "Daniel Porter!" She repeated, her voice trembling. "That's my son." "Yes, ma'am," the man said gently. "It appears the ownership was transferred last year. Everything's legally filed." Helen felt her knees weaken. Her fingers clutched the counter to steady herself. "That's impossible. I never signed anything like that." The clerk looked at her with quiet sympathy. "Perhaps you should check with your family," he said softly. "Maybe it was arranged on your behalf." She walked home in silence. The world outside blurred cars' voices, sunlight. Everything moved except her. At the door, Sophie greeted her with a bright smile. "Mom, you're back early. Everything okay?" Helen stood still, her voice barely a whisper. "I went to pay the house tax. They said the owner is Daniel." For the first time, Sophie's smile faltered, but only for a second. Then she laughed lightly, waving her hand. "Oh, that. It's just a technical thing. We changed it for convenience. Taxes, insurance, easier to handle when it's under Daniel's name. Don't worry, Mom. The house is still yours." Helen looked at her, really looked at the calmness, the ease, the way Sophie poured tea as if nothing mattered. Her stomach turned. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" she asked quietly. Sophie met her eyes, calm, almost pitying. "We didn't want to stress you out. You know how paperwork is. You signed it yourself, remember?" Helen froze. "I signed it." Sophie smiled, sweet as ever. "Yes, on Daniel's birthday. You said anything for my son, remember? We just added your signature for the property transfer. You even toasted to it." For a moment, Helen's mind went blank. Then, like broken glass cutting through memory, it came back: Daniel's birthday. The wine, the laughter. Sophie handing her a folder wrapped with a ribbon. "Just sign here, Mom," Sophie had said, smiling. "A little birthday tradition." Helen's breath caught. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "That was the property transfer." Sophie didn't flinch. "It was just paperwork, Mom. The house is still your home. Don't make this dramatic." Helen turned away, her eyes stinging. She walked to the cabinet where Sophie kept all the important files. Inside, neatly stacked and labeled, was the truth. She pulled out the document, the notarized deed of transfer. There it was. Her name scratched out from owner to previous owner. And beneath it, Daniel's name, bold and official. The date, April 17th, Daniel's birthday. Her signature, shaky but real, sealed the betrayal. Helen stared at the paper as if it were a living thing. Every line felt like a blade, every word a quiet wound. The air in the room thickened. From the kitchen, Sophie's voice drifted in, casual, unaware of the storm she had lit. "Mom, would you like me to make tea?" Helen didn't answer. She sank into the chair, the paper still trembling in her hands. Her heart beat slow, steady, heavy. All at once, the memories of the past months fell into place. The sold chair, the missing photographs, the pension investments. Each piece was part of a pattern she hadn't wanted to see. The kindness had been a curtain, the warmth a weapon, and love had been the price she paid to be betrayed beautifully. That evening, Helen stood alone in the quiet house. The sunset stretched across the walls, painting everything gold, the same color as the trust that had blinded her. She placed the paper on the table, smoothing it gently with her hands. Her voice, when it came, was calm, not broken, not angry, just resolved. "If they used a contract to betray me," she whispered, "then I will use a contract to take everything back." The words hung in the air, quiet but sharp, a promise, not a threat. Helen folded the deed carefully, placed it back into its folder, and locked it away. Her eyes no longer trembled. Her hands no longer shook. Outside, the wind shifted, cool, deliberate, like the turning of a page. The house, stripped of laughter, now held something new, a pulse of determination. There comes a moment when loss no longer hurts, it hardens. After the truth came to light, the house no longer felt like home. But the worst part wasn't the papers or the lies. It was the days that followed, the small humiliations dressed as kindness. It began with boxes. One morning, Helen woke to find Sophie and Daniel in the hallway, folding her clothes and labeling them neatly. "Mom," Daniel said gently, "we thought it'd be better if you stayed in the small room upstairs. It's quieter, more private." Helen blinked, confused. "But why this is my room?" Sophie smiled, her tone light and perfectly rehearsed. "We just want you to have your own space, Mom. You deserve privacy. The main bedroom is closer to the patio. We'll use it for guests, okay?" Guests. She watched as they carried away the quilt she had sewn herself, the photograph of her wedding, the small lamp that used to sit by her husband's side of the bed. Each item disappeared one by one, swallowed by their version of modern living. By noon, the room was empty. Only the faint mark on the wall where her husband's picture had hung remained. That and the silence. The next weekend, the house filled with voices, laughter music, the clinking of glasses. Sophie had invited friends over for a housewarming. Helen stood at the edge of the hallway clutching a tray of snacks, unsure where to place herself. "Oh, that's Daniel's mom," someone whispered. "She lives here, right?" Sophie laughed softly. "Yes, she's staying with us for now. She likes it here. It's peaceful." Helen froze. Staying with us. Not living in her house, not her home. Later that night, as the music echoed through the walls, Sophie knocked gently on her door. "Mom, I hope you don't mind, but could you stay in your room while the guests are here? The kids are using the living room for games. It's just for tonight." Helen smiled faintly. Of course. She sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the laughter downstairs, young voices, in a house that no longer remembered her. The smell of perfume and wine drifted through the air, covering the faint scent of lavender she used to love. It wasn't anger she felt, not yet. It was something deeper, heavier, like being erased in slow motion. Days turned into weeks. Sophie redecorated everything. Her husband's workshop became a yoga studio. The old bookshelf was replaced with a minibar. Even the mailbox outside bore a new brass plate, Daniel and Sophie Porter. Helen watched quietly as each piece of her life was rewritten, smiling politely when Sophie explained the changes. "It's all for the best, Mom. The house needs new energy. You'll get used to it." One afternoon, Helen came downstairs for tea and saw strangers sitting in her living room. Two of Sophie's friends lounging on her sofa, their shoes on her rug. Sophie walked in laughing. "Mom, this is Claire and Jenna. They're staying for a few days. I hope you don't mind. There's plenty of space." Helen said nothing. She simply nodded, poured herself tea, and went back to her small room. As she passed the hallway mirror, she caught a glimpse of herself. Shoulders hunched, eyes dim. A guest. That's what she had become. A few nights later, as dinner ended, Sophie leaned back in her chair, her tone silky and effortless. "You know, Mom, technically the house belongs to Daniel and me now, but you can still stay as long as you want. Think of it as living together." Helen's fork paused midair. Her voice came out calm, steady, too calm. "You mean I'm a guest in my own house?" Sophie blinked, feigning surprise. "Oh no, Mom. Don't put it like that. It's just practical. Your family, of course, but legally speaking." Helen cut her off gently. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it was made of something unbreakable. "It's strange, isn't it, to live as a guest in the very house where you were born as someone's mother?" Sophie's smile faltered for the first time. She busied herself with the dishes, pretending not to hear. Daniel kept his eyes down. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that doesn't explode but settles deep and cold. That night, Helen walked through the house after everyone had gone to bed. The lights were dim. The laughter had died. Only echoes remained faint and cruel. She stopped by the living room, her fingers brushing against the frame of a missing photograph. Her husband's face smiled back at her from memory alone. She whispered softly, "I won't cry, Ernest. Not for them, not for this." Her reflection in the window was still almost unfamiliar. She touched the glass gently and added, "They used deceit to take what was mine. I'll use truth to take it back." And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The tremble in her hands disappeared. The grief in her chest turned to focus, and the silence that had once trapped her became her weapon. She turned off the light, walked back to her room, and closed the door quietly. For the first time in months, she didn't feel powerless. She felt prepared. Some wars are not fought with anger, but with patience and paper. Helen lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house above her hummed faintly, Sophie's laughter drifting from afar. But this time, Helen didn't flinch, because in her mind the plan had already begun. And for the first time, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like the perfect stage for her quiet revenge. When they tried to make her a tenant in her own home, she decided to become one legally. The storm inside Helen had passed. No more tears, no shaking hands, only stillness, the kind that hides purpose beneath silence. One crisp morning, she walked out of the house and took the bus downtown, clutching a worn leather purse. Her destination, the small law office of Mr. Harold Matthews, an old friend of her late husband Ernest. the same man who had handled their wills years ago. He looked up from his desk as she entered, surprise flickering across his kind eyes. "Helen Porter," he said, standing to greet her. "It's been ages." Helen smiled faintly. "I need your help, Harold. It's about the house." She told him everything slowly, calmly, as if she were reciting a story that had already happened to someone else. How Daniel and Sophie had tricked her into signing the transfer papers, how they'd moved her to the small room, how she now lived like a guest in the home she once owned. Mr. Matthews listened without interrupting, his brow furrowed. When she finished, he leaned forward, voice firm but measured. "Helen, you may have lost the title but not your rights. If they want to treat you as a tenant, then let's make it official. Get everything in writing. If they took the house through paperwork, we'll use paperwork to take it back." Helen's eyes lifted sharp and steady. "You mean a rental contract?" He nodded. "Yes. Draft a legal lease. 3 years. Fixed term. Make them sign it and make sure you pay every month by check or transfer. Keep every receipt, every message, every word. From now on, everything is evidence." Helen sat in silence for a moment, then smiled, the first genuine smile in months. Ernest used to say the same thing she whispered, "Fight clean but fight smart." That evening, Helen returned home and waited until Sophie came back from work. She stood in the kitchen, calm and composed, holding the freshly printed contract. "Sophie," she said softly, "since the house is legally yours and Daniel's, I thought it'd be proper if I paid rent, just to make things clear." Sophie blinked, surprised, then amused. "Rent? Oh, Mom, that's not necessary. But if it makes you feel better, sure, as long as you pay on time." Her tone dripped with mock politeness. Helen only nodded, sliding the document across the counter. 3 years, she said. "Fixed term. I'd prefer to have it in writing." Sophie skimmed it, smirked slightly, then signed. "Fine by me. You've always been so proper." Helen smiled faintly. "It's how your father raised us." And just like that, the paper that had once stolen her home now became her shield. From that day forward, Helen paid rent precisely, punctually, every month. She kept each receipt neatly in a folder dated signed and photocopied. When Sophie accepted the cash or transfer, Helen would press record on her small phone, her voice calm and clear. "Here's the rent for this month, Sophie." "Thank you, Mom." Sophie would reply, her tone indifferent, and click another entry added to the archive of truth. Helen also began keeping a journal, small brown leather filled with quiet precision. Every word mattered. She documented everything, every slight, every remark, every act of exclusion. April 3rd. Sophie told me not to use the main bathroom. Said it was for guests. April 15th. Daniel laughed when I called it my kitchen. Said it's not mine anymore. April 29th. Rent paid $200, recorded and signed. Each page became a witness not to pain but to strategy. Her handwriting was steady, her tone clinical. She no longer argued, no longer raised her voice. Instead, she listened, watched, wrote. Because revenge, she had learned, didn't have to scream. Sometimes it could whisper through ink and paper. Sophie noticed the change. The woman she used to patronize was suddenly polite, distant, unreadable. Gone were the trembling hands, the pleading eyes. Helen was courteous, too courteous. She greeted guests, smiled at meals, and disappeared into her small room without a sound. To Sophie, it looked like surrender. To Helen, it was camouflage. One night, Sophie made a joke over dinner. "As long as you pay rent on time, Mom, you can stay forever." Daniel laughed. Helen raised her glass of water and replied softly, "That's exactly what I intend to do." Sophie didn't notice the glint in her eyes, the quiet promise hiding behind the words. Weeks passed. Each transaction became another piece of her invisible wall of proof. Each insult another stone she laid in silence. Mr. Matthews called her once to check in. "How are things going?" Helen smiled through the phone. "Perfectly. They think they've won." He chuckled. "Good. Let them believe it. When the time comes, we'll remind them that even walls built on lies can crumble under truth." Late one evening, Helen sat at her small desk writing in her journal. The lamp cast a golden light across the page. On the wall above hung her husband's photograph, the only one she'd managed to keep. She looked up at him and whispered, "You'd be proud, Ernest. I'm not fighting with tears anymore. I'm fighting with paper." The house was quiet the night long, but this time she didn't fear the silence. It was hers again. Every word she wrote, every document she kept, was a brick in her return. Outside, the wind rustled softly through the garden, a whisper that no longer sounded like warning, but like approval. Because some wars are not fought in courts or kitchens. They are fought in silence with patience, records, and truth. And Helen Porter was ready. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the sound of a plan being loaded. Helen had always been a quiet woman, but quiet didn't mean powerless. While Sophie believed her silence was defeat, Helen was building something beneath it carefully, piece by piece, like a chessboard only she could see. Weeks had passed since she became the tenant. To everyone else, she was harmless, an old woman who cooked, paid rent, and kept to herself. But under the surface, her strategy was taking form. One morning, she took the train to the city again. She wore a simple gray coat, her hair neatly tied, her purse filled not with money but with documents. Inside the office of Mr. Harold Matthews, she placed a folder on his desk. He opened it, brows lifting. "Helen, what's this?" "A company," she said quietly. "I'd like to register at Golden Leaf Holdings." Matthews tilted his glasses. "A business at your age?" Helen smiled faintly. "Not mine, my grandson's." She explained her grandson, Evan Porter, son of Andrew, had just turned 21. A bright, honest boy who loved numbers and trusted his grandmother completely. Golden Leaf Holdings would be registered under his name with a clear, innocent purpose: to invest in small residential properties and restore historic homes. Matthews leaned back, impressed. "You're creating a legal entity separate from your son's household, separate from your own name." Helen nodded. "Exactly. I want to make sure this company can acquire property." She paused, her tone light, but edged, including perhaps one very familiar house. Matthews chuckled softly. "You've learned well, Helen." "I've learned from the best," she replied, "from those who thought I couldn't." As paperwork moved quietly through the system, another discovery emerged. While reviewing the old transfer deed, the one that had stolen Helen's house, Matthews noticed something odd. "Helen," he said during their next meeting, "I found an inconsistency. The transfer wasn't properly advised. You were never given independent legal counsel when you signed." He flipped the pages toward her, pointing at a missing signature line. "That makes the deed voidable. It can be challenged in court, even reversed." Helen's eyes lit up with something fierce, not joy, not revenge, but clarity. "So, the weapon they used to take it from me," Matthews smiled, "can be used to take it back." Helen leaned back, breathing deeply. The plan was no longer a dream. It was law written in her favor, waiting to be used. But she didn't rush. She knew Sophie's greatest weakness wasn't greed, it was arrogance. And arrogance only bloomed when it believed it had already won. So Helen began her theater. She cooked dinners again, the same comforting meals Sophie used to love. She smiled, laughed softly, even asked Sophie for advice on modern decor. Some evenings, she joined them in the living room, pretending to watch television, nodding at every word Sophie said. Sophie took the bait completely. The woman she once saw as a threat now seemed harmless, tamed. "Mom's finally accepted it," Sophie told Daniel one night. "She's calmer. It's better this way." Helen overheard those words from her small room upstairs, and for the first time in months, she smiled genuinely quietly. Because every smile she gave, every polite nod, every question about recipes and colors was part of the script she was writing, a performance with one purpose: to make Sophie lower her guard. Meanwhile, Golden Leaf Holdings quietly came to life. The company had a clean record, a young CEO, and a modest bank account. No one could trace it back to Helen, not even Sophie, who prided herself on knowing everything. Matthews handled the filings personally. "We'll let them think you're just living out your final years," he said. "By the time they realize what's happening, they'll be tenants, not owners." Helen chuckled softly. "I've paid rent long enough. Let's see how they like it." At home, Sophie's routines carried on: yoga classes, wine nights, dinner parties. Daniel was often away, lost between guilt and convenience. And Helen remained invisible, or so they thought. She cleaned up after their parties, noted the damage to the walls, the noise complaints from neighbors. Each note, each photo went into her journal, evidence of neglect. Every detail mattered now. She wasn't gathering proof for emotion, she was building a case. One evening, Sophie found Helen humming in the kitchen, stirring soup. "You're in a good mood, Mom," she said casually. Helen looked up, smiling. "Oh, I am. You know, Sophie. Peace is easier when you stop fighting what you can't change." Sophie smirked. "I'm glad you finally understand." Helen's gaze lingered on her, gentle, unreadable. "Oh, I understand perfectly." She turned back to her pot, hiding a faint smile as the steam rose. Because Sophie was right about one thing, Helen had stopped fighting what she couldn't change. She had simply started preparing to change everything else. That night, Helen sat at her desk, pen gliding across her journal. "They believe I'm done. That's good. Let them relax, let them laugh. They won't hear it when the click comes, the sound of my silence loading." She closed the book, set her glasses aside, and whispered toward her husband's photo. "I promised you, Ernest, I wouldn't cry. Now it's time to make them remember who taught this house the meaning of ownership." Outside, thunder rolled softly across the night sky. Helen didn't flinch. She only smiled, calm, deliberate, ready. Because my silence isn't surrender, she thought. It's reloading. Sometimes you don't have to destroy people. You just let them destroy each other. Weeks passed and the house began to fracture, not from noise or damage, but from the weight of its own secrets. Daniel had started coming home later, his face drawn, his voice sharper. Sophie, on the other hand, had grown louder, her laughter too high, her perfume too heavy, her phone always turned face down on the table. Helen noticed it all. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Every evening, she would sit in her small upstairs room, pretending to read, while their voices floated up through the floorboards. The arguments always began the same way, softly, like rain before a storm. "Where were you? Out. With friends. At midnight I needed air, Daniel. You wouldn't understand." Then came the sharper edges. Bills left unpaid, credit cards declined, withdrawals from accounts Daniel hadn't known existed. One night, as plates clattered in the kitchen, Sophie's voice sliced through the silence. "You're accusing me of spending too much. Without me, you wouldn't even have this house." The words hit Daniel like a slap. He froze, his voice trembling between confusion and anger. "What do you mean without you?" Sophie crossed her arms, smirking. "Oh, please. You think your mother just handed you this place? It was my idea to put it in your name. I handled everything. You just signed where I told you." Daniel stared at her, the color draining from his face. "What are you saying, Sophie?" But Sophie had already turned away, sipping her wine with an indifferent shrug. "I'm saying maybe you should thank me once in a while." That night, Helen heard the door slam. Footsteps stomped down the hallway, and then silence. She sat by her window, the lamp unlit, the faint sound of wind moving through the curtains. Her reflection in the glass almost smiled, not from cruelty, but from inevitability. Over the next few days, Daniel changed. He started staying home quietly, watching Sophie the way she once watched him. He noticed her phone lighting up at odd hours, the whispers in the garden, the perfume lingering long after she said she'd been shopping. He noticed the unopened bills, the missing cash, and then he noticed the way she looked at him. Not like a partner, like a liability. Helen said nothing, but she could feel it, the balance shifting. The house that had once made her invisible was now turning its gaze inward, exposing every crack. At breakfast, Daniel's hands shook slightly as he stirred his coffee. Sophie scrolled through her phone, pretending not to see him. The air between them was heavy, thick with unspoken things. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Sophie, did you ever love me, or was it just—" She didn't let him finish. "Don't start this again," she snapped. "You're paranoid." He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time he saw what Helen had seen all along. The charm that once dazzled him was now sharp calculated, a mirror that only reflected what it needed to. That evening, Helen came downstairs quietly. Daniel was sitting alone at the table, staring at the mortgage documents, the ones Sophie had made him sign. His eyes were red, his jaw tight. When he noticed her, he quickly folded the papers. "Mom," he said, forcing a smile. "Did you need something?" She shook her head, her voice soft. "No, Daniel, just tea." He hesitated, then asked, almost whispering, "Did you ever doubt her, Sophie, I mean?" Helen poured hot water into her cup, the steam curling between them. She met his eyes, calm, steady, without accusation. "I doubted myself first. That's how they got away with it." Daniel looked down. "I think she's hiding something." Helen sipped her tea, her tone even. "Then stop looking for lies in her words. Watch her actions. They'll speak louder." He nodded slowly, lost in thought. For the first time, Helen didn't feel pity. She felt balance. The son who once doubted her was beginning to see the truth for himself. Over the next week, the tension grew unbearable. Daniel's patience wore thin. Sophie's nights grew longer. And Helen, she remained silent, collecting each word like a note in a symphony that was finally reaching its crescendo. One night, another fight erupted, louder, sharper, the kind that shakes walls and ends marriages. "I saw the bank statement, Sophie." "What's Golden Leaf Holdings?" "Just an investment." "Why are you snooping through my things?" "You're hiding money, aren't you?" Helen froze, upstairs listening. Golden Leaf Holdings, the company in her grandson's name, the perfect bait. Sophie's voice turned cold. "You think you're so smart, Daniel, but without me you'd still be renting a flat. I made you a homeowner. I made you something." Daniel's voice cracked, half fury, half heartbreak. "You made me a fool." The door slammed again. This time Helen didn't flinch. She simply closed her book, whispering to herself, "He's finally hearing what I tried to tell him years ago." For the next few days, Daniel barely spoke. He spent hours walking outside, phone in hand, scrolling through old emails, old files, all the evidence that once seemed meaningless. Helen watched from the porch as he pieced it together bit by bit. The missing documents, the hidden transfers, the manipulation he had refused to see. She didn't interfere, she didn't comfort. Because sometimes truth is like medicine, you have to let it burn before it heals. At dinner, Sophie tried to keep her smile, but Daniel's silence was louder than any argument. When she laughed, it fell flat. When she spoke, no one answered. Even the house seemed to have turned against her. That night, Helen wrote in her journal, "The cracks are showing, not because I pushed, but because truth always finds its own way out. I don't need to speak. My silence has already started the war they can't win." She closed the book gently and turned off the lamp. Downstairs, muffled voices rose again, sharp, tired, desperate. But Helen just smiled in the dark, because this time her silence wasn't submission. It was the sound of awakening, not hers, but her son's. Revenge doesn't always wear fire and fury. Sometimes it signs in ink and smiles in silence. A few weeks passed after the fights. The house had grown heavier, not from noise, but from the weight of unspoken things. Daniel was distant. Sophie was restless. And Helen, she was invisible again. At least that's what they thought. While the couple argued, Helen and Mr. Matthews were busy finishing the one thing Sophie had never bothered to check details. It began with a simple envelope, neatly typed, discreetly delivered, carrying the gold logo of Golden Leaf Holdings. Inside was a formal letter. "We are interested in acquiring your property at 14 Maple Grove Lane. Our client is prepared to offer 15% above current market value, immediate payment, no conditions." Sophie's eyes lit up when she read it. A number big enough to erase debt fund her new wellness business and move into something more modern. She waved the letter in Daniel's face like a trophy. "This is it, the perfect opportunity. We can sell and finally upgrade." Daniel frowned. "This house, it's our family home. My mother? Your mother rented here?" Sophie cut him off sharply. "This is our investment, Daniel. Don't get sentimental." He hesitated, torn between guilt and exhaustion. She softened her voice, resting a hand on his arm. "Just think new beginnings, no more tension. We'll start fresh." And like so many times before, Daniel gave in. Because sometimes the easier choice feels safer than the right one. Within a week, the paperwork was ready. Sophie handled everything, of course. She met with the buyer's representative, smiled, signed, and laughed about how simple the process was. The money came through swiftly, a clean transfer, professional and precise. Golden Leaf Holdings now officially owned the house. To easy money, Sophie toasted that night, raising her glass of wine. Daniel clinked half-heartedly. To new beginnings. Helen watched quietly from her small room, the faint sound of their laughter drifting upward like smoke. It was strange, she thought, how final laughter could sound when it belonged to those who didn't know they were the punchline. 2 weeks later, transfer day. The morning was bright, crisp, and unassuming, the kind of morning that looked innocent even when it carried justice inside its sunlight. Sophie was dressed perfectly for the occasion, polished smile, cream blazer, everything rehearsed. Daniel stood beside her, silent, uneasy. The buyers were due at 10. At exactly 10:05, the doorbell rang. When Sophie opened it, her smile froze. There, standing at the threshold, was Helen Porter, flanked by Mr. Matthews holding a leather case of documents. Helen stepped inside calmly, her eyes moving over the living room one last time. "Good morning, Sophie. Daniel." Sophie blinked, confused. "Mom, what are you doing here? The buyers are coming any minute." "Oh, I'm aware," Helen said softly. "In fact, I am the buyer." Sophie laughed, a quick, nervous sound. "What?" Mr. Matthews set the folder on the table and opened it with surgical precision. "Allow me to confirm," he said. "Golden Leaf Holdings. The purchasing entity is managed by Mr. Evan Porter, Helen's grandson. The transaction was conducted legally and finalized yesterday. The funds you received came directly from their account." Daniel's mouth fell open. Sophie's face drained of color. "That's impossible," she whispered. You can't." Helen smiled faintly, her tone almost kind. "I can, and I did." She walked slowly across the room, touching the back of a chair, the edge of the piano, the thing Sophie once called clutter. "Thank you," she said gently, "for keeping the house safe while I was away." Her words were soft, but they landed like thunder. Sophie stumbled forward. "You tricked us. This is fraud." Matthews raised a calm hand. "On the contrary, every step was lawful. You signed willingly. You accepted full payment. The sale is complete." Daniel looked between them, dazed. "Mom? This company? It's yours." Helen turned to him, her eyes warm, steady, unshaken. "No, Daniel, it's your nephew's. But the home, it's back where it belongs in the family." Sophie tried to speak, but no words came. Her voice failed where arrogance once lived. The silence that followed was almost sacred. No shouting, no chaos, just the slow crumble of realization. Everything Sophie had built on deceit had folded under the weight of a single signature. Helen's voice broke the stillness, gentle but firm. "You once told me, Sophie, that this house was yours, that I was just a tenant. Now, legally speaking, you're the one renting space." Sophie's lips trembled. Daniel lowered his head, shame coloring his silence. Helen turned toward the door. Her steps were light, certain. At the threshold, she looked back once more. "Don't worry," she said softly. "I've learned how to take care of what's mine." Then she left the sound of her heels echoing across the floor that no longer belonged to them. Outside, the air was cool, the sky washed clean. Mr. Matthews fell into step beside her, his expression a mixture of pride and disbelief. "You really did it," he murmured. Helen smiled, small, serene, unshakable. "They used a contract to take it. I used one to take it back." He nodded, chuckling quietly. "Justice with paperwork, my favorite kind." Helen looked ahead, sunlight catching the silver in her hair. "No, Harold, it's not justice, it's balance." Back inside, Sophie stood frozen in the living room, staring at the empty doorway. Daniel sank into a chair. The papers spread across the table signatures that now bound them in irony. "She played us," Sophie whispered. Daniel didn't answer. He just stared at the deed, the one with his own name crossed out. Because now there was nothing left to say. The house had chosen its true owner, not through emotion, but through truth. And somewhere down this quiet street, Helen walked calmly, the keys of Maple Grove Lane resting in her hand. Her silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was light-free. For some battles, you don't raise your voice. You just raise your pen. When truth finally arrives, it doesn't knock. It walks in quietly and leaves nothing standing but honesty. Days passed, and the echo of that final confrontation lingered through every corner of the once proud house. Sophie and Daniel had moved into a small rented apartment, modern, yes, but hollow. No laughter, no warmth, only the sound of regret filling the rooms. The papers were signed, the money spent, and yet nothing felt won. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, as the morning news murmured from the TV. The headline flashed across the screen: "Local couple loses home and legal oversight transfer deemed valid." The reporter's voice was clinical, detached. But to Daniel, every word landed like a stone. He turned off the television, silence settling heavy around him. Sophie stood near the window, phone in hand, scrolling furiously, emails, messages, lawyers. "We can fight this," she hissed. "We'll sue. We'll make her give it back." Daniel looked up, eyes empty. "There's nothing to fight, Sophie. Everything was legal. You signed it all." "Because you told me to," she snapped back. "No," he said quietly. "Because you wanted to." For the first time, Sophie had no answer. She turned away, her reflection in the glass, looking smaller than ever, a woman who had built her future on someone else's foundation, and watched it collapse beneath her heels. That evening, Daniel drove across town. He didn't tell Sophie. He just needed to see her, his mother. Helen was tending her small garden when the headlights swept across the driveway. She looked up as Daniel stepped out of the car, ice-swollen, voice breaking. "Mom," he stopped, words choking in his throat. "I'm sorry, I just wanted to help her. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought..." Helen didn't move at first. Then slowly she set down her watering can and walked toward him. Her voice was gentle but steady. "The right thing never needs to hide, Daniel. And real love doesn't ask you to betray the people who made you who you are." He tried to speak, but the words came out as tears instead. "I didn't know she'd go that far. I didn't know she'd..." Helen stopped him with a soft touch to his shoulder. "No, you did know. You just hoped she'd change." Daniel looked at her, broken, guilty. "I thought people deserved second chances." Helen's eyes softened, but there was steel beneath her calm. "Your mistake wasn't giving her a second chance, my son. It was believing she ever loved you enough to deserve one." He covered his face, sobbing not from anger, but from release. The burden he had carried for so long was finally being lifted by truth, even if it came with pain. Helen wrapped her arms around him. "You were a good man, Daniel, just blind in the wrong direction. Now open your eyes not to hate her, but to forgive yourself." Later that night, Sophie tried one last time. She went to a lawyer, a different one, younger. Sharper, convinced that Helen must have manipulated something. But every file she handed over came back stamped, sealed, and flawless. Each contract checked, each payment documented, each signature authentic, her own. The lawyer looked up, sympathetic but firm. "Mrs. Porter, there is no fraud here. Everything your mother-in-law did was legal, even admirable." Sophie's voice trembled. "You're saying she outsmarted me?" "No," the lawyer said softly. "I'm saying she understood the law better than you understood love." Sophie left without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, a small sound but final. In the following days, whispers began to spread through their neighborhood. The local newspaper headline was shared across coffee shops and dinner tables. Clever elderly woman reclaims family home through legal mastery. Some called it justice. Others called it karma. But for Helen, it wasn't either. It was peace. Back at her restored home, Helen placed a small framed photo on the mantel, her husband Ernest smiling from another lifetime. Next to it, she added a new one, Daniel as a boy laughing in the garden. She sat down, the light from the fireplace reflecting in her eyes. "You see, Ernest," she whispered, "I didn't have to destroy them. I just had to let truth do its job." Outside, the wind brushed gently against the windows, carrying no anger, only closure. A week later, Daniel visited again, this time calmer. He brought a bouquet of daisies, her favorite. As they drank tea together, he looked around the living room, clean, warm, familiar. "It feels like home again," he said softly. Helen smiled. "Because it finally is. Not because of walls or deeds, but because of honesty." Daniel nodded, the lines of regret slowly softening into understanding. "Mom, thank you for not giving up on me." Helen touched his hand. "I almost did. But then I remembered forgiveness is the only thing that ends a family war." He smiled faintly, tears glinting at the edge of his lashes. "You're stronger than anyone I know." "No," Helen said gently. "I just learned to stop mistaking silence for weakness." As the night deepened, mother and son sat in peace, no noise, no lies, only truth between them. Outside, the moonlight fell across the porch, silver and forgiving. Sophie never came back, and the world in its quiet way carried on. But those who read the story in the paper that week, elderly woman wins back home from deceptive couple, didn't see vengeance. They saw grace wrapped in intelligence, justice born not from rage, but from patience. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud. It's lawful, it's graceful, and it leaves you standing where you've always belonged, home. After every storm, there comes a morning so gentle, it almost makes you forget the rain. Spring had returned. The air was softer now, no longer heavy with tension or deceit. Inside the Porter home, sunlight poured through freshly cleaned windows, the same windows that once reflected silence and sorrow. Helen stood in the hallway holding a bucket of water and a rag. Every stroke of her hand across the old furniture felt like washing away ghosts. The scent of lemon oil and fresh paint filled the air. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. In the backyard, Daniel knelt beside a patch of earth that had long been neglected. His hands were covered in dirt, his shirt soaked in sweat, but his eyes were calm. Beside him, Helen carried a tray of young rose bushes, her husband Ernest's favorite. Daniel looked up as she approached. "I remember when Dad used to plant these," he said softly. "He'd hum that old tune from your wedding day." Helen smiled, setting down the tray. He said roses were proof that beauty can grow even from thorns. They worked together silently for a while, turning soil, placing roots, patting down earth. Every movement felt like rebuilding something more than a garden. When Daniel straightened up, he looked around at the rows of roses, still small, still fragile. "It's strange," he murmured. "This house feels lighter." Helen nodded. "Because truth has weight, Daniel. Lies are what make walls heavy." He smiled faintly, wiping his hands. "Mom, you won." Helen paused, glancing toward the roses, their leaves trembling gently in the breeze. Her voice was calm, steady. "No, my dear, I didn't win. I just took back what was already mine." The afternoon passed with laughter, quiet, unforced. Daniel found himself talking about his childhood, about climbing the old oak tree, about his father teaching him how to fix a fence. Helen listened, smiling through tears she didn't bother to hide. It had been years since the house echoed with that sound laughter that wasn't forced voices that didn't tremble. Inside, Helen placed her husband's photo back on the mantel. The same spot it had always been, now dusted, polished, surrounded by blooming roses in vases. She whispered, "You'd like it this way, Ernest." The house is quiet again, not because they're gone, but because peace finally came home. From the garden, Daniel called out, "Mom, come look, the first one's already opening." Helen stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sun. Among the newly planted bushes, one rose had indeed begun to bloom, a small, perfect blush of red in the middle of all that green. She knelt beside it, touching a petal as gently as if it might vanish. "It's your father's rose," she said softly. "He planted this breed himself. It always blooms first." Daniel smiled. "Guess it's his way of saying welcome back." As dusk fell, the mother and son sat on the porch steps, tea in hand, watching the sky turn gold to violet. The scent of roses drifted through the yard. A bird landed on the fence, chirping a simple melody, familiar, peaceful. Daniel glanced at his mother. "You ever think you'll forgive her, Sophie?" Helen took a long sip of tea, thinking. Forgiveness isn't for her, she said quietly. It's for us. It's how we make sure the hurt doesn't grow roots again. He nodded. Then after a pause, I don't think I deserve your forgiveness either. Helen turned to him, eyes soft. You don't need to earn it, Daniel. You just need to live better than before. For the first time in a long while, he believed her. That night, as stars shimmered above the quiet garden, Helen sat by the window writing in her journal, the same one where she had once recorded pain, betrayal, and plans for justice. Now her words were different. Day 1. The roses are blooming again, not as symbols of revenge but of release. The soil remembers pain, but it also forgives. She closed the book gently and placed it beside a small vase of pink roses. The petals glowed faintly in the lamplight, soft as memory, strong as truth. Before bed, she stepped outside one last time. The garden shimmered under the moon, every bloom whispering life back into the night. Daniel had gone home, promising to visit tomorrow. Helen stood barefoot in the grass, breathing deeply, the scent of soil roses and peace filling her chest. You were right, Ernest, she whispered to the stars. You can't kill something rooted in love. It always finds a way to bloom again. The wind carried her words softly through the garden, brushing over every petal, every leaf. The roses swayed gently, not in mourning, but in answer, because healing doesn't shout. It grows quietly, patiently, until one morning you wake up and realize the thorns no longer hurt. Some stories don't end with a door closing. They end with a message left behind, waiting for the right heart to open it. A quiet Sunday afternoon. The sun slipped through lace curtains, casting golden patterns across the floor. Helen sat at her old oak desk, the same one Ernest once used to balance his ledgers, write birthday cards and draft letters in his careful handwriting. Now, it was her turn. On the table before her lay a single sheet of thick stationery, cream-colored, faintly scented with lavender. Beside it, the heavy iron safe that had belonged to her late husband. The lock was old, the metal cool beneath her fingers. Helen picked up her pen. Her hand no longer trembled when she wrote. Each stroke was deliberate, calm, certain. My dear sons, she began, if one day you find this letter, it means life has moved on as it always does. By now, this house may not look the same. The roses will have grown wild again, and perhaps my chair will sit empty by the window. She paused, smiling faintly. The image was not sad, it was peaceful. I've learned that home is not made of walls, but of honesty. It is not the roof that protects us, but the truth we choose to live under. When truth leaves a house, it doesn't collapse in noise. It collapses in silence. Her eyes glistened, but her heart was steady. You both made mistakes, as did I. But what defines a family is not the absence of failure, it's the courage to face it. Remember this, never let convenience replace conscience, and never mistake affection for ownership. Helen stopped thinking of Daniel's tears, of Andrew's letters from afar, of the long road that had brought her here. If you ever lose everything she wrote, remember you still have the power to begin again. I did, and it was the most freeing thing I ever did. She signed her name with a quiet flourish, Helen Porter, and folded the letter carefully. Sliding it into a small envelope, she sealed it with a drop of wax and pressed the Porter family crest a rose into the seal. Then she opened the old safe. Inside were relics of a life fully lived. Ernest's pocket watch, their wedding photo, the title deed of the house now resting peacefully under her name again. She placed the letter on top and closed the door with a soft click. Let them find it when they're ready, she whispered, not before. Months later, Andrew came to visit. The house was blooming roses climbing the fence, sunlight painting the walls in warmth. Daniel greeted him at the door with a smile that had finally learned peace. They talked for hours about the garden, about work, about how time had softened everything that once burned. Then as evening fell, Daniel said quietly, "There's something you should see." He led Andrew to their father's old study. The iron safe stood in the corner untouched for years. Mom said there's something inside, Daniel murmured. I never opened it. I wasn't ready. Together they turned the dial, the old lock clicking open like a whisper from the past. Inside the letter waited the paper, slightly yellowed, the wax seal still intact. Andrew opened it slowly, his eyes scanning each line, his breath catching halfway through. By the time he reached the end, his vision blurred. He folded the letter gently, holding it against his chest. She never wrote for pity, he said softly. She wrote to remind us who we are. Daniel nodded, voice trembling. She didn't just win back a house, Andrew. She taught us what it means to keep our integrity. The brothers stood there in silence. Two men who had once been divided by pride and distance, now reunited by a mother's words. Later that night, Andrew placed the letter back into the safe, leaving it slightly ajar, not locked away this time but left open, ready for the next generation to find. She wanted us to remember, he said, that a house doesn't make a family. The truth does. Outside, the roses rustled softly in the wind, petals brushing against the glass, like a mother's hand lingering one last time. In the final light of day, Helen's voice seemed to echo through the quiet house, gentle, eternal. If you ever doubt what home means, look not at the walls, but at the heart still honest inside them. That's where love lives. That's where I'll always be. Because a house built on deceit will always crumble, but one built on truth becomes a legacy. Some homes are built from stone and wood, others from forgiveness. A full year had passed since the storm that changed everything. The Porter house now stood calm, surrounded by sunlight and blooming roses. Its walls, once echoing with betrayal and silence, had become a sanctuary of peace. Helen moved more slowly these days, but her steps carried purpose. Every morning she walked through the halls, touching the banister-opening windows, letting light and air fill every corner. It felt as though the house itself breathed again. One crisp morning, a knock came at the door. Helen opened it to find a young woman standing there, pale, nervous, holding a little boy by the hand. Her name was Mara, a single mother who had just lost her job. She had heard through the church that Helen sometimes helped people. "I can pay rent, just not much," Mara said softly. "We only need a small room just for a few months." Helen looked at the woman, saw in her eyes the same exhaustion she once saw in her own reflection years ago. Then she looked at the boy, no older than 5, clutching a toy car, eyes full of hope. She smiled. "Come in, dear. You'll stay upstairs." Mara hesitated. "But the rent." "No," Helen interrupted gently. "This house once was taken from me. Now it will be used to give someone else a home." The young mother burst into tears, whispering thanks she couldn't finish. Helen placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here. That's all that matters." Weeks passed. Mara found work at a local bakery, and her son Liam filled the house with laughter that had been missing for far too long. Every evening, the smell of fresh bread and children's giggles floated down the staircase. Sometimes Helen would pause at the bottom of the stairs and listen, smiling to herself. This was what the house had always needed, not wealth, not ownership, but warmth. One afternoon, as she tended to her roses, Daniel stopped by with groceries. He stood on the porch watching the little boy chase a butterfly in the yard. "You've turned this place into a miracle, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Helen laughed softly, brushing soil from her hands. "No, Daniel. The miracle isn't the house. It's what happens when you stop guarding it and start sharing it." He smiled, remembering the woman who once fought quietly, who had turned her pain into wisdom. "You really forgive everyone, don't you?" Helen looked at him, her eyes clear, kind. "Forgiveness isn't a favor, son. It's freedom." As evening fell, she sat by the window, the same spot where she once wept. Now her reflection looked peaceful, lines of age softened by light. She opened her journal one last time and wrote, "They took my house once, but they could never take my dignity. I paid rent to learn a priceless lesson. No one ever grows poor by being honest. We only grow poor when we let greed live where kindness should." She closed the journal and placed it on the shelf beside her husband's photograph. Outside, the sun sank behind the trees, spilling gold across the garden. The next morning, the air shimmered with new light. Helen stepped into the yard, watering the roses, the earth cool beneath her feet. Mara waved from the upstairs window. Little Liam ran across the lawn, laughing, a paper airplane gliding through the air. Helen looked up at the house, its windows glowing with warmth, its heart alive again. She whispered to herself, "A home reborn through kindness will never be lost again." She turned off the hose, stood still, and lifted her face toward the morning sun. Its light caught in her silver hair and the petals of the roses in the open windows above. Everything was bright, simple, true. The house that had once been stolen had become something greater than ownership. It had become grace. They took her house once, but never her peace. Because the truest home is not built from walls, it's built from dignity, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again.